So it's finally time. It's finally time to talk about the Scorpio. And it's a system I've been really interested in for a little while now, mostly because it seems like an interesting idea, but I don't know how well it's going to work in the situation that Microsoft's in currently. So while most companies attempt to lure in customers to their system by using first-party games you can only get on their system, Microsoft seems to be taking a different approach. They want to build a system that is strong enough to do 4K images, of course, for the customer or the consumer who has the really nice TV, the really nice setup. They want to appeal more to the prosumers, which isn't a bad thing to appeal to because those are the people who are going to spend the money on a pretty expensive system as long as it offers them the experience that they want. So I think Microsoft is content right now with releasing a system and then getting the third-party support over and doing all they can to market it as the best experience you can get if you want 4K visuals without upscale, without compromise, I guess is the way they're going. But overall, it's an interesting situation. I figure we talk about it. We can get into the specs, what I think will be in the box, and then really what their challenges are when they get closer to release day. So the first thing we have is their release day. It looks like they're shooting for the end of 2017. I'm thinking probably in that the second week of November. A lot of time they like to do that to get through the initial push because initial allocation usually sells out, and then they can work on that second shipment to get into the holiday season where it will probably sell out again. So I would look in November, probably the first or second week. That's usually when these systems launch. That was around when the Xbox One and the PS4 launched. They were separate weeks, so it kind of fell a little later into November. And then, of course, the Pro launched in November, early November as well. Now let's get into the specs of the system, what we think will be in there. And that kind of brings us to the big debate of the entire system. And that is it going to have Ryzen, the new CPU is in it, and is it going to have Vega, the soon-to-be released GPU from AMD. So the specs that we know of right now, we know it's going to have 320 gigabytes a second bandwidth for memory, which is massive. That is the same as the GTX 1080. So that should give the system the ability to do 4K overall. But then we also have to get into other aspects like what the GPU can do. We need to also look at different things, specifically what type of memory is going to be in there. With that 320 gigabytes through, I have to imagine that it is more or better than GDDR5. I think it will place it somewhere in the neighborhood of GDDR5X. That makes sense. I don't think they go any other way. I think that is probably the cheapest option right now as well. And they would probably stick with their 12 gigs of GDDR5X memory like they've talked about, where 12 gigs seem to leak out. That makes sense because if you think about it, the PS4 Pro needed to add an extra gig to help with its operating system tasks while it is rendering 4K. Whereas the Xbox One is using a type of Windows, which is probably heavier than what's on the PS4 Pro. Give it more RAM so that they can do things like push those large 4K images, but then still have their operating system, which should be heavier, work well. That bandwidth, memory bandwidth, really caught me off guard considering that is actually probably 100 gigs more per second than the PS4 Pro, which is why it leads me to believe that it is AMD's next generation video cards, Vega. I do think Vega will show up in Scorpio. I don't think Ryzen will be in there. I think they will stick with the CPU, the Jaguar, the 8-core Jaguar. That will probably stick with it. It'll help with parity across the board because remember, Microsoft they really want it to work on the regular Xbox One and the Scorpio. They want developers to develop for two different systems, essentially. So I think the thing that they can, one, save money on, and two, help developers with, is keep the CPU mostly the same. Now, they can, of course, overclock the Jaguar like the PS4 Pro has it. And keep in mind, that doesn't seem to hold the PS4 Pro back too much. They can still do 4K, and then they, of course, upscale some parts. I do think that is because of the GPU being around 4.2 teraflops and Polaris, as opposed to the Scorpio having a 6 teraflop Vega GPU that would help push those 4K images. So far we have the Vega GPU, the 8-core Jaguar, 12 gigs of GDDR5X memory, probably a 1 terabyte hard drive. Keep in mind they do have that USB 3.0 external hard drive enabled. I don't think they would go for that 2 terabyte because that would increase pricing despite not giving as much functionality since you can just put an external hard drive with it and you're good. I did catch that artist rendering or the rendering that they showed us of the Scorpio board. A couple things were interesting. Of course, that 12 gigs is technically visible because it has 12 memory modules around it. But if you look off to the left, I noticed there was like a 6-pin plug for power. I assume that's because the power supply is internal. That's probably why it's internal, because maybe it has to plug into another part of the board to help power that SoC, as opposed to just one plug obviously being integrated onto the board with the power supply. They need 2 plugs maybe, and that's interesting because that's almost like an off-the-shelf part where you have a 6-pin plug, and maybe that's just showing how much closer these systems are getting to just being computers in little boxes. So we have an internal power supply, Vega GPU, normal 8-core Jaguar CPU that's probably overclocked, somewhere in the 2.3, 2.4 gigahertz range is my assumption, 1 terabyte drive, and an internal power supply, which is an interesting choice. I think that was forced because they need that 6-pin power plugged in. So after that, we have to figure out, is Microsoft's decision to make a very powerful system that may be priced out of people's price range, if that makes sense. So let's get to the price. I think with what they are suggesting here, the price will probably be around $500. They could go as high as $600. Phil Spencer has come out and said it's a premium system with a premium price tag. And it's a tag we've seen before, he said. He said it's not like a new pricing or they're not making a price up. It's not going to be $700 or more is what I think he was trying to say, but it could be anywhere from $600 or less. I think $500 makes sense. Keep that regular CPU that they already have, expand on the GPU with Vega, and then save money on the hard drive by putting a 1 terabyte in there. And I think $500 will cut it. I think they would get away with it as long as they show that it is more powerful. As soon as they have to start upscaling, though, which will probably show up in 60 frame per second games, then you have a problem, because the PS4 Pro, which will probably be $150 cheaper, by the way, by the time this comes out, I feel like Sony will drop it $50. It's going to be a tough sell, because you have the PS4 Pro over here that has more games and also does 4K because it's on the back of the box, so of course it does 4K, right? That's all you need to convey it to consumers, is that it's on the box and that it technically shows up on their 4K TV, because they won't know any better. They don't want to know what checkerboard upscaling is. They just want to know it does 4K and that it plays the PS4 exclusives and the third-party games, which will show up on both. So I think Microsoft, as much as they want to give a 4K, true 4K experience, is going to have a tough time in the holiday season even against Sony. I don't think the Scorpio is going to show up and all of a sudden outsell the PS4 Pro. In fact, I see the PS4 Pro outselling the Scorpio pretty easily Christmas time, mostly because, 1, the pricing, and 2, the games. The PS4 Pro will just have more games. It'll have all the third-party support. I just don't know how the Scorpio is going to compete like Microsoft wants it to without having first-party games. I think that's the biggest thing that Microsoft really needs to turn around and focus on. They need to stop focusing on their hardware and start signing games. I mean, they've canceled Scalebound. I know they have Crackdown, Sea of Thieves, both of which will probably show up on the computer, which is a whole nother subject on its own. So what's the point in really buying a Scorpio? Is it just to play true 4K games? And what happens when it does upscale? Then what's the premium there? What's the point in buying a Scorpio if it's just going to do the same thing the PS4 Pro does, but it's more money? But that's all on the Scorpio. I'm really curious to see what your guys' thoughts are. What do you think the specs will be? Do you think it makes sense to release alongside the Pro that already has steam from a year of sales? Let me know down below, guys. Let me know what you think the specs will be too, and the price. I will see you guys next time.